All right. So have you ever like wondered what makes you you? Like what makes each of us so unique,
Yeah.
you know? But then at the same time, like how are we all still connected as humans?
It's a it's such a fascinating question, and really it's one that researchers have been trying to figure out for for decades, really.
Yeah, watching.
And what we're going to kind of unpack today is really how much of who we are is shaped by our genes and how much is shaped by our experiences.
Right, like that age-old question, nature versus nurture.
Exactly. Yeah. And this deep dive that we're doing is based on chapter 4 of a psychology text called Nature, Nurture, and Human Diversity. And it's just packed with some really intriguing research and real life stories that I think will help kind of illustrate just how, intertwined nature and nurture really are.
Okay, I'm already intrigued.
Yeah.
So where do we even begin with such a complex topic?
Well, I think a great place to start is with behavior genetics. And really what behavior genetics is all about is trying to understand how genes and environment kind of work together to shape our behavior.
So it's kind of like detective work in a way?
It's very much like detective work. Yeah, the researchers are trying to untangle the threads of nature and nurture.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah.
Okay, so then we're talking about like DNA, genes,
Yeah.
chromosomes, all of those like tiny building blocks of life.
Yes.
Um, for our listeners who might need a quick refresher, could we just break those down real quick?
Absolutely. So think of your DNA as like a massive instruction manual for building a human being right.
Okay, go.
So it's the complete set of genetic instructions that we inherit from our parents.
Okay.
And then within that instruction manual, there are specific chapters you can think about them, and those are called chromosomes.
Okay.
And each chromosome contains, thousands of individual genes, and these genes are like specific blueprints for building proteins, which are like the workhorses of our bodies.
So DNA is the overall plan. Chromosomes are the chapters, and genes are the blueprints within each chapter.
That's a great way to put it. Yeah.
Got it.
Oh,
Okay.
perfect.
But here's the thing that always like boggles my mind. If we humans share something like 99.9% of the same DNA,
Hmm.
why are we all so different?
Well, that's the incredible part, right? That tiny 0.1% variation in our genes is what makes all the difference.
Wow.
You can kind of think about it like this. If you change just one ingredient in a recipe, it can totally alter the taste of the dish.
Yeah, totally.
Similarly, even small variations in our genes can lead to pretty big differences in our, physical traits or predispositions to certain diseases and even, aspects of our personality.
It's like we're all so unique, But it also makes you think how much of who we are is already like pre-programmed in our genes.
Yeah, that's where things get really interesting, and to try and understand, how much our genes and environment kind of contribute to these individual differences. Researchers have often turned to twin studies.
Right? Those classic twin studies we always hear about.
Exactly, those classic twin studies. And the reason why twin studies are so valuable is that there are two types of twins, right? You have identical twins, you have fraternal twins.
Right.
And so identical twins develop from a single fertilized egg that splits.
Oh,
So they share 100% of their genes.
wow.
Whereas fraternal twins develop from two separate eggs,
Okay.
just like any other siblings.
Got it.
And so by comparing identical twins to fraternal twins, researchers can get a sense of, how much a particular trait might be influenced by genes.
So, for example, if identical twins are more likely to share a certain trait, like let's say a sense of humor,
Yeah,
than fraternal twins, that might suggest that genes play a pretty big role.
exactly. And in fact, studies have found that identical twins, even those who are raised apart, are much more similar in personality traits like extroversion or neuroticism than fraternal twins are. And there are some pretty incredible cases of identical twins who were separated at birth who later in life exhibit these like astonishing similarities.
Like the Jim twins.
The Jim twins.
I remember reading about them. They had so many like uncanny coincidences, even though they were raised in completely different environments.
It's mind-blowing, and the Jim twins are kind of a classic example of this. So they were separated at birth, and then they were reunited at age 38, and they discovered that they had led these like eerily similar lives.
Yeah, like what were some of the things they had in common?
Well, they had both married and divorced women named Linda,
Wow.
and then they remarried women named Betty. They both had sons named James Allen. They smoked the same brand of cigarettes, they drove the same type of car, and they even vacationed at the same beach in Florida.
That's wild.
It's crazy, right?
Yeah, it really makes you think about like the power of genes.
Yeah.
But what about the other side of the coin, like our environment? Surely our experiences also play a huge role, right?
Oh, absolutely. And to study the impact of environment, researchers often look at adoption studies.
Okay.
So in adoption studies, they compare adopted children to both their biological parents and their adoptive parents.
So essentially, they're trying to like tease apart the influence of genes from the influence of upbringing.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Clever.
And the findings from these studies are actually pretty revealing. So adopted children tend to be more similar in personality to their biological parents,
Even though they've never met them.
even though they've never met them,
Wow.
than they are to their adoptive parents who raised them.
That's pretty powerful evidence for the role of genes in shaping our personalities.
Yeah, it seems to suggest that our personalities, do have a pretty significant genetic component.
But what about other aspects of who we are, like our values or our beliefs or even our behaviors?
Yeah.
Those just feel more influenced by like upbringing and culture to me. Well, you're raising a really important point, and while personality does seem to have, this strong genetic component, adopted children are still deeply influenced by their adoptive families.
No.
So their upbringing has a really significant impact on their attitudes, their values, their manners, their faith, their political views.
So even though our genes might predispose us to certain personality traits, it sounds like our environment can still shape us in really profound ways.
Absolutely. And it's also important to remember that even within the same family, children experience their environment differently.
Right.
And that leads to these unique outcomes.
It's almost like our genes lay the foundation, and then our environment kind of adds the finishing touches.
I like that analogy. It's this intricate dance between nature and nurture that ultimately shapes who we are.
I love that. Okay, so this whole conversation about genes and environment makes me think about the concept of temperament.
Yeah.
You know how some babies are just like naturally more easygoing while others are kind of more sensitive or reactive? Is temperament something we're born with, or is it shaped by our early interactions?
Well, temperament, which is essentially a person's kind of characteristic emotional reactivity and intensity, seems to be pretty heavily influenced by genes.
Okay.
Studies show that identical twins, even those raised apart, tend to have more similar temperaments than fraternal twins.
So some babies really are just wired to be more emotionally intense from the get-go.
It seems that way.
Wow. But then how does that play out as they grow up?
Well, interestingly, temperament tends to be relatively stable throughout life.
Really?
So a highly reactive infant is likely to be a more sensitive child, and then later on, a more emotionally intense adult.
So it's like a consistent thread throughout their development.
Yeah, and of course, this doesn't mean that environment doesn't play a role. Parenting styles and experiences can definitely influence how that temperament is expressed.
Right. It's not like a life sentence, but it's definitely something to keep in mind as parents and educators.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, so all of this is incredibly fascinating, but it also makes me wonder, how do we actually measure the relative contributions of genes and environment?
Yeah.
Is there like a scientific way to quantify how much of a trait is due to nature versus nurture?
There is, and that's where the concept of heritability comes in.
Okay.
So heritability is a statistical estimate of the proportion of variation in a trait within a particular population that can be attributed to genetic differences.
Okay, so if a trait has high heritability, does that mean it's mostly determined by genes?
Well, not necessarily, and here's the key. Heritability is about differences within a group, not between groups.
Okay, I think I'm following.
So let's say, for example, we're looking at height.
Okay.
Heritability for height is quite high.
Okay.
Meaning that the differences in height we see among people within a particular population are largely due to genetic differences.
Right.
But if we compare height between two populations, say a well-nourished population and a malnourished population,
Yeah.
the differences in average height would likely be due to environmental factors like nutrition,
Right.
not just genes.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
So heritability gives us kind of like a snapshot of how much variation we see in a trait is due to genes within a specific group.
Exactly.
But it doesn't mean that environment doesn't play a role, especially when we're comparing different groups or considering factors like nutrition or upbringing.
Exactly. And that brings us back to this really crucial point, which is that genes and environment always work together. Our genes provide the initial blueprint,
Right.
but our experiences determine how those genes are expressed.
Okay, so let's talk more about the interaction between genes and environment.
Yeah,
Can you give us like some specific examples of how this interplay actually shapes our traits?
absolutely. So a simple example is the development of calluses.
Okay.
If you walk barefoot a lot, you'll develop calluses on your feet.
Right.
And this isn't because your genes suddenly changed. It's because the environment, in this case, the friction of walking barefoot, triggered a biological response leading to the formation of calluses.
So our genes have the potential to create calluses, but it takes an environmental trigger to kind of flip that switch.
Exactly. Yeah.
What are some other examples of this kind of gene-environment interaction?
Well, one of the most fascinating areas of research is epigenetics.
Okay, I've heard that word before, but I'm not entirely sure what it means.
Yeah, it's a relatively new field, but
Mm.
but essentially epigenetics explores how our experiences can actually alter how our genes function.
Without changing the underlying DNA sequence.
Right, without changing the underlying DNA sequence.
Okay, so you're saying that our experiences can actually change how our genes work.
That's exactly what we're finding.
That's mind-blowing.
It is pretty amazing.
How is that even possible?
It's like having a dimmer switch on our genes that can turn them up or down depending on our environment.
So it's not just about the genes themselves, but it's also about how those genes are being used or expressed.
Precisely. Yeah. And what epigenetics is revealing is that our environment, especially during childhood, can leave these lasting marks on our genes.
So even though we inherit our genes from our parents, our experiences can shape how those genes are used throughout our lives.
Exactly. Our genes aren't our destiny. Our environment plays a really powerful role in shaping who we are, even at the molecular level.
This is also incredible. It seems like the more we learn about genes and environment, the more we realize how incredibly complex and interconnected they are.
Yeah, it's really fascinating.
But I'm curious, how does this understanding of human diversity apply to the bigger picture?
Right.
Like, how can it help us understand human behavior on a broader level?
Well, that's where the field of evolutionary psychology comes in.
Okay.
And essentially, evolutionary psychology applies the principles of natural selection to try to understand human behavior.
So we're talking survival of the fittest and how certain traits might have been passed down through generations because they helped our ancestors survive and reproduce.
Exactly. Yeah. Evolutionary psychologists argue that many of our, universal human tendencies, from our capacity for language to our fear of snakes, can be traced back to adaptations that increased our ancestors' chances of survival and reproduction.
So it's like looking back through time to understand why we are the way we are today.
Yeah, it's kind of like piecing together a puzzle using clues from our evolutionary past.
I like that analogy.
Okay.
So I have to ask, how does evolution explain something as complex as human sexuality?
Yeah, that's a question that has generated a lot of discussion and debate.
Right.
But evolutionary psychologists suggest that men and women might have evolved different mating strategies because they faced different reproductive challenges throughout human history.
What do you mean by different reproductive challenges?
Well, for women, reproduction's a much greater investment.
Okay.
Pregnancy, childbirth, and breastfeeding require a significant amount of time and energy and resources.
Right.
So this suggests that women might have evolved to be more selective in choosing mates, looking for partners who can provide resources and support to ensure the survival of their offspring.
So evolutionary pressures might have led women to be more cautious and discerning when it comes to choosing partners.
That's one interpretation. Yeah.
Interesting.
But it's really important to remember that this is just one perspective, and there are other viewpoints to consider as well. And we'll dive into those different perspectives and explore the nuances of evolutionary psychology in more detail a little bit later.
All right, sounds good. I'm ready to hear more.
Yeah. So yeah, it's a very complex area, and while the evolutionary perspective does offer some intriguing insights, it's essential to consider, other viewpoints as well. And,
Right.
and one of those is social learning theory.
Okay.
And social learning theory suggests that our behaviors, including those related to mating, are heavily influenced by what we observe and what we learn from our culture and society.
So it's not just about biology and instinct, but also about the social scripts we're exposed to and the messages we absorb from our surroundings.
Exactly. And social learning theory suggests that we learn about relationships and gender roles and what's considered, attractive or desirable through observation, through imitation, through reinforcement, from our families, our peers, the media, the broader culture.
That makes a lot of sense if we grow up seeing certain relationship patterns modeled or hearing certain beliefs about gender roles repeated over and over. It's bound to shape our own expectations and behaviors.
Right, and it seems like this could lead to quite a bit of cultural variation in how sexuality is expressed and perceived.
Absolutely. Cultural norms have a huge impact on our attitudes towards, dating Merit sexuality, even what's considered acceptable behavior within a relationship.
Yeah, what might be considered normal or desirable in one culture could be viewed as taboo or even illegal in another.
It's a good reminder that there's no single right way to approach relationships or sexuality.
Right.
Different cultures have different values and expectations, and those shape how we understand and experience these aspects of our lives.
Hmm.
But let's swing back to evolutionary psychology for a moment. I know there's some pretty strong criticisms of this approach, especially when it comes to explaining differences between men and women. What are some of the main concerns?
Well, one criticism is that evolutionary psychology sometimes falls into the trap of what's called hindsight bias, or working backward.
Okay.
So critics argue that it's too easy to start with an observed difference between men and women,
Right.
and then come up with an evolutionary explanation that seems to fit. But they question whether this approach is truly scientific or whether it's just storytelling after the fact.
So it's like saying, well, men and women behave differently in this way, so there must be an evolutionary reason for it, without necessarily having strong evidence to back it up.
Exactly. And critics worry that this kind of backward reasoning can lead to circular arguments and that it doesn't really advance our understanding of human behavior in a meaningful way.
And I imagine there are also concerns about the potential for evolutionary explanations to reinforce harmful stereotypes about gender roles and differences.
Yeah, that's another valid concern. And some worry that if we accept the idea that certain behaviors are, biologically programmed or rooted in our evolutionary past, it could be used to justify or excuse harmful behavior or reinforce gender inequality.
It's like saying, well, men are just naturally more aggressive because of evolution, or women are inherently more nurturing because of their biological role in child rearing.
Right.
And those kinds of statements can be dangerous because they ignore the complexities of human behavior and the powerful influence of culture and socialization.
You're hitting on a crucial point. Critics argue that evolutionary explanations can sometimes essentialize gender differences and overlook the tremendous variation within each gender,
All right.
as well as the fact that gender roles and expressions are constantly evolving and changing, over time and across cultures.
It's a reminder that we need to be very careful about making sweeping generalizations about gender based on evolutionary theories. But how do evolutionary psychologists respond to these criticisms?
Well, evolutionary psychologists acknowledge that their field is still relatively young.
And that there's a lot more research to be done, and they argue that their goal isn't to justify the status quo or reinforce stereotypes, but rather to understand the underlying psychological mechanisms that might have evolved over time to help our ancestors survive and reproduce.
Okay.
They also emphasize that evolutionary explanations don't negate the importance of culture or individual learning. They see human behavior as a product of this complex interplay between biology, environment, and culture.
So it's not about saying this is how men and women are, but rather these are some potential evolutionary influences that might have shaped certain behavioral tendencies, but they don't dictate who we are or how we must behave.
Exactly. Responsible evolutionary psychologists are cautious about overgeneralizing or making deterministic claims about human behavior. They recognize the tremendous flexibility and adaptability of human beings and acknowledge the powerful influence of culture in shaping how we express our innate tendencies.
So it seems like the key takeaway here is that human behavior is incredibly complex.
And it's rarely, if ever, explained by a single factor like biology or evolution. It's always about the interaction of nature and nurture.
That's a great way to sum it up. Yeah, it's always this dance between our biology and our experiences.
Speaking of experience, we can't talk about human diversity without diving into the profound impact of culture.
Absolutely. Culture shapes so much of who we are, our beliefs, our values, our behaviors, our communication styles, even our sense of self.
It's like the air we breathe. We're often so immersed in our own culture that we don't even realize how much it's influencing us.
Exactly. And it's only when we step outside of our own cultural bubble, either through travel or, interactions with people from different backgrounds, that we start to see the invisible forces that have been shaping us all along.
I've definitely had those aha moments when traveling where I suddenly realized that something I thought was just normal or common sense was actually a product of my own cultural upbringing.
Yeah, I think we all have.
But how do we even begin to understand the vast diversity of cultures around the world? Are there any overarching frameworks or concepts that can help us make sense of it all?
Well, one helpful framework is the distinction between individualist and collectivist cultures.
Right. We touched on this briefly earlier. Can you remind us what those terms mean and how they shape people's values and behaviors?
Of course. So individualist cultures like the United States tend to prioritize personal goals, independence, and self-reliance. People are encouraged to stand out, to express their unique qualities, and to pursue their own paths, whereas collectivist cultures, like many Asian cultures, emphasize interdependence, group harmony, and duty to family and community.
So in individualist cultures, the focus is on me, while in collectivist cultures, it's more about we.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Okay.
And this difference in values permeates many aspects of life.
Okay.
So, for example, in individualist cultures, direct communication is often valued. People are encouraged to speak their minds, to share their opinions, and to advocate for themselves.
That's like the stereotype of Americans being very direct and sometimes even blunt.
Exactly. And of course, these are just broad cultural patterns, not absolute truths.
Mhm.
But in collectivist cultures, indirect communication is often preferred. People might be more hesitant to openly disagree or criticize, as preserving group harmony is a higher priority.
Right.
So they might use more subtle ways of communicating their message.
It makes you wonder if all those cultural misunderstandings in movies and TV shows are actually based on some real differences in communication styles.
Yeah, there's probably some truth to that. But beyond communication, this individualist collectivist dimension also shapes how people view themselves. So
Interesting.
in individualist cultures, the self is seen as independent and autonomous.
Okay.
People define themselves based on their unique traits, their skills, their accomplishments. They might say, I am a successful entrepreneur, or I am a creative artist.
So their identity is more rooted in their individual achievements and qualities.
Right? In collectivist cultures, the self is seen as more interdependent. So people define themselves in terms of their relationships with others, their roles within the family or community, and their contributions to the group. They might say, I am a loving daughter, or I am a loyal friend.
It's fascinating how these cultural values shape our very understanding of who we are. It's almost like two different lenses through which to view the world and ourselves.
Yeah, it's a really powerful influence.
But how do these differences play out in something like parenting?
Parenting is a great example. So in individualist cultures, parents often emphasize independence and self-reliance.
Okay.
They might encourage their children to, express their individuality, pursue their own goals, think for themselves.
So it's about nurturing their child's unique potential and encouraging them to become their own person.
Exactly. In collectivist cultures, parents might place more emphasis on obedience, respect for elders, and fitting in with the group.
So the focus might be more on instilling values of harmony, duty, and respecting the needs of the family or community.
Right. And these different cultural values shape the ways parents interact with their children, the expectations they have for their behavior, and even the types of activities they encourage.
It's amazing to think how deeply culture influences something as fundamental as parenting. But with all this talk about cultural differences, I'm curious, are there any universal truths when it comes to gender? Are men and women inherently different, or are those differences mostly a product of culture?
That's a question that has been debated for centuries.
Right.
And to untangle this, it's important to distinguish between sex and gender. So
Okay.
sex refers to the biological differences between males and females. Those are determined by chromosomes, hormones, and reproductive anatomy.
Yeah.
Gender, on the other hand, is about these socially constructed roles, behaviors, expressions, and identities associated with being male or female.
So our bodies determine our sex, but our minds define our gender.
That's a helpful way to think about it. And while there are sort of average biological differences between males and females, like differences in hormone levels or brain structure,
Right.
culture plays a huge role in shaping how those differences are expressed and interpreted.
So are you saying that the differences we often see between men and women, like differences in aggression or communication styles, are more a product of nurture than nature?
It's rarely one or the other. Both biology and culture contribute to those differences.
Okay.
So, for instance, research suggests that men, on average, tend to be more physically aggressive than women, and this could be partly due to hormonal differences, particularly testosterone.
So there's a potential biological influence there.
Yes, but aggression is also profoundly influenced by social norms. And learning boys are often encouraged to be more assertive and physically active, while girls might be socialized to be more passive or nurturing.
Right.
And these social expectations can shape behavior just as powerfully as biology can.
It's like that old saying, boys will be boys. But really, it's more like boys will be what we teach boys to be.
Exactly. And the same goes for girls. It's crucial to remember that biology doesn't dictate destiny. Both nature and nurture are constantly interacting to shape who we are.
This whole conversation is making me rethink my own assumptions about gender. But I'm still curious about how we develop our own sense of gender identity.
Yeah.
Is it something we're born with, or is it something we learn?
Well, there are different theories about how gender identity develops social learning. The theory suggests that we learn about gender through observation and imitation.
So if a little girl sees her mother doing most of the cooking and cleaning, she might start to associate those activities with being female and begin to imitate those behaviors.
That's the basic idea. However, social learning theory doesn't fully explain why some children very strongly identify with their assigned gender, while others feel like their gender identity doesn't match their biological sex.
So there must be more to it than just observation and imitation.
Right. And some theorists propose that we develop what are called gender schemas, which are mental frameworks that help us organize our understanding of gender. And these schemas develop early in childhood as we observe and categorize the world around us, noticing patterns in how boys and girls are treated, what they wear, what activities they engage in, and what roles they occupy in society.
So we start to create these mental categories of male and female, and we try to fit ourselves and others into these categories.
Yes, and these gender schemas can be helpful in making sense of the world, but they can also be quite rigid and limiting.
It makes you wonder if these early gender schemas might contribute to the stereotypes and biases we often see around gender.
It's certainly possible, and this brings us to the topic of transgender individuals whose gender identity differs from the sex they were assigned at birth.
Right, and it's clear that transgender individuals face unique challenges and often experience discrimination and prejudice. What are some of the things we can do as individuals and as a society to better understand and support the transgender community?
Well, education is key. The more we learn about gender identity, gender expression, and the diversity of human experiences, the more we can challenge our own biases and create a more inclusive world. And it's also crucial to listen to and respect the lived experiences of transgender people.
Yeah.
They are the experts on their own identities, and their voices deserve to be heard and amplified.
I couldn't agree more. Learning from and listening to those with different lived experiences than our own is so crucial for personal growth and for creating a more just and equitable society. This whole conversation has really highlighted how complex and multifaceted gender is. But before we get too carried away, I want to circle back to something we talked about earlier, the incredible world of epigenetics.
Yeah.
Can you remind us what epigenetics is all about and why it's so important?
Sure. So epigenetics is this fascinating field that explores how our experiences can actually change the way our genes work without altering the underlying DNA sequence.
Okay.
Think of it this way. Your genes are like a cookbook filled with recipes. And epigenetics is like adding sticky notes or highlighting certain recipes based on what you like to cook.
Okay.
So those notes don't change the recipes themselves, but they influence which ones you use most often.
So our genes provide the blueprint, but our experiences can influence how that blueprint is read and expressed.
Precisely. And what kinds of experiences can trigger these epigenetic changes? Well, it's a wide range, everything from diet and exercise to stress exposure to toxins, social interactions, and even early childhood experiences can leave epigenetic marks on our DNA.
So it's not just our genes themselves that matter, but also how those genes are being used or expressed based on our experiences. It's like our environment can add bookmarks or highlights to our genetic instruction manual.
That's a great analogy, and what's remarkable is that some of these epigenetic changes can be passed down to future generations.
Wait, really, you mean experiences we have in our lifetime could potentially affect the genes of our children and grandchildren?
That's what research is suggesting. It's a bit mind-boggling, but it means that the legacy of our experiences could extend far beyond our own lifetimes.
That's both fascinating and a bit daunting. And it
Right.
really underscores how interconnected we are across generations. But let's shift gears for a moment and circle back to evolutionary psychology before we touched on some of the criticisms of this approach. But I'd love to hear more about its potential strengths and what it can offer our understanding of human diversity.
Yeah, evolutionary psychology, despite its controversies, does provide a really valuable framework for understanding why humans behave the way they do. And by considering our evolutionary history, we can start to see patterns in human behavior that might otherwise seem puzzling.
Can you give us some concrete examples of how taking an evolutionary lens can shed light on human behavior?
Sure, one classic example is the phenomenon of stranger anxiety in infants.
Okay.
So from an evolutionary perspective, it makes sense that babies would develop a fear of strangers around the time they become mobile. Because in our ancestral past, a crawling or toddling baby who wandered away from their caregivers would have been vulnerable to predators or other dangers. So a healthy dose of stranger anxiety could have been adaptive, promoting survival by keeping babies close to their protectors.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
It's amazing to think how these ancient evolutionary pressures might still be shaping our behavior today. But what about more complex behaviors like altruism or cooperation?
Right.
How does evolution explain why humans sometimes act selflessly, even when it seems to go against their own self-interest?
That's a fascinating question, and evolutionary psychologists have proposed several explanations for altruism. One idea is what's called kin selection,
Okay.
which suggests that we are more likely to help those who share our genes, such as our close relatives.
So it's like a way of indirectly promoting the survival of our own genes, even if we're not the ones directly benefiting from the act of altruism.
Precisely another explanation is reciprocal altruism, which suggests that we help others with the expectation that they will help us in return someday. And this kind of cooperation can be mutually beneficial and promote survival, especially in challenging environments where individuals need to rely on each other for support.
It makes you wonder if those pay-it-forward chains are rooted in some deep evolutionary drive towards reciprocal altruism.
It's an interesting thought.
But let's be honest, evolutionary psychology gets a bit trickier when it comes to explaining differences between men and women, as we discussed earlier. Some critics argue that it can reinforce gender stereotypes and even justify harmful behaviors.
You're right, that's a valid concern, and it's crucial to emphasize that evolutionary psychology doesn't claim that men and women are locked into rigid, predetermined roles. It simply suggests that certain biological and evolutionary pressures might have contributed to some average differences we observe between the sexes.
So it's not about saying this is how men are or this is how women are in some absolute sense.
Not at all. Responsible evolutionary psychologists emphasize that culture and individual experiences play a huge role in shaping how any evolved tendencies are expressed. We have a remarkable capacity for learning, for adaptation, for overriding our impulses. We should always be cautious about overgeneralizing or using evolutionary explanations to excuse harmful behavior.
It's a powerful reminder that we're not just puppets of our genes or our evolutionary history.
Yeah.
We have agency, we make choices, and we can shape our own destinies. But with all this talk about nature and nurture, I'm wondering, is there a way to synthesize these different perspectives into a more holistic understanding of what makes us who we are?
Well, that's the ultimate goal, right? Instead of seeing nature and nurture as these separate forces, we need to recognize that they're constantly interacting and influencing each other.
Right.
Our genes provide a starting point, but our experiences, our choices, and the cultural context we live in all shape how those genes are expressed and how we develop as individuals. It's this dynamic interplay that creates the beautiful tapestry of human diversity.
It's like a beautiful dance between our biology and our experiences, with each step shaping the next.
Yeah.
It's a reminder that we're not just passive recipients of our genes or our environment. We are active agents in our own development, constantly shaping and reshaping who we are throughout our lives.
And that's what makes the study of human nature so endlessly fascinating. We're constantly learning more about the intricate interplay of forces that make us who we are, but there's always more to discover and explore.
This has been such an illuminating conversation. I feel like I've gained a whole new perspective on what it means to be human. But before we wrap up our deep dive, I'd love to leave our listeners with a final thought-provoking question to ponder. We've talked a lot about how our genes and environment shape who we are, but what about free will?
Yeah.
If our biology and our experiences play such a powerful role, do we truly have control over our choices and destinies?
That's a question that has occupied philosophers and scientists for ages. And while we've learned a great deal about the biological and environmental influences on human behavior, there's still a sense of mystery surrounding the nature of consciousness and free will. It's a question each of us grapples with as we navigate the complexities of life. Perhaps the answer lies not in finding a definitive solution, but in embracing the mystery and recognizing the incredible power and potential of the human spirit.
What a beautiful way to wrap up our deep dives. It's a reminder that even with all the scientific advances we've made, there's still so much we don't know about the human experience. But that's part of what makes it so endlessly fascinating. So to our listeners, we encourage you to keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep marveling at the wonders of nature and nurture. And as you go about your day, consider this. How might understanding the interplay of genes and environment inspire you to make different choices, to approach others with more compassion, or to create a world that nurtures the full potential of every human being? Until next time, keep diving deep.